My prison guard father brought me to work on a lockdown day, then his most violent inmate went missing from solitary. The corrections officer who found me hiding under the administrative desk at Harrogate Correctional Facility at 4:22 in the afternoon was not my father. My father was somewhere in the East Wing with every available officer trying to account for a man named Darius Fell, who had been in solitary confinement for 11 days and was now not. The officer who found me was a woman named C.O. Priya Nanthakumar, 8 years on the job, and she crouched down and looked at me under the desk and said, "You're Ray Kowalski's kid." I said, "Yes." She said, "Your dad is going to have a very bad month." I said I knew. She said, "Come out from under there, slowly." I came out slowly, because everything inside Harrogate happened slowly when it wasn't happening terrifyingly fast, and those were apparently the only 2 speeds available in a facility that housed 340 inmates, including one who had been in solitary for assaulting 2 officers and was now gone like smoke through a locked door. I was 16 years old. I had been at Harrogate for approximately 5 hours. Those 5 hours had rearranged my understanding of my father, his job, and the particular gap between what adults tell you about where they work and what actually happens there. I need to tell you about my father before I tell you about Darius Fell, because understanding one requires understanding the other. Raymond Kowalski had been a corrections officer at Harrogate for 19 years, since he was 26, since before I was born. He was a large, deliberate man who moved through our house in Millbrook, Pennsylvania, with the careful awareness of someone who had spent 2 decades in environments where awareness kept you safe. He was not a man who talked much about his work. When I was younger, I had thought this was because his work was boring. Paperwork, standing around, making sure people stayed in their cells. I was, as I came to understand over the course of that Thursday, profoundly wrong about this. My father's work was not boring. My father's work was a complex, constantly shifting negotiation with human volatility, and he did not talk about it at home because he had understood, long before I did, that some things needed to stay contained in the space where they happened. He was not wrong about that. He had just miscalculated one Thursday in April when his regular babysitter canceled, school was out for a teacher development day, and my mother was 2 states away at her sister's house, and he had made a decision he would spend a long time regretting. He had cleared it with his sergeant, a man named Earl Drummond, who had 23 years in corrections and who my father had worked alongside for most of his career. Earl Drummond was a compact, precise man who wore his uniform like it had been issued to his specific body. He had met me twice at department picnics and remembered my name both times, which I had found impressive and which my father said was because Earl Drummond forgot nothing, which was both his greatest professional asset and the reason he had 3 ex-wives. Earl had approved the visit with conditions. I was to stay in the administrative wing. I was not to interact with any inmates. I was to be escorted at all times, and I was to leave by 3:30 at the latest, before the evening shift change created the controlled chaos that accompanied every transition at Harrogate. The conditions were reasonable. The day had not been reasonable. The first strange thing happened at 11:40 in the morning, about an hour after I arrived. My father had settled me in the break room with a chair, a bottle of water, a bag of pretzels, and a clear instruction not to move unless C.O. Nanthakumar came to get me, and he had gone to begin his rounds. The break room was beige and functional, with a coffee maker that sounded like it was in physical pain every time it cycled, a table with 4 mismatched chairs, and a bulletin board covered in scheduling notices and a laminated sheet about workplace stress resources that had been there so long the corners were curling. I was doing homework, a P history, the kind of assignment that transforms any other environment into a relative improvement. When C.O. Nanthakumar came in for coffee and said, without particular alarm, "They're doing a count," I said okay, because I did not yet understand what a count was in the specific context of a count that was unscheduled. A scheduled count was routine. An unscheduled count at 11:40 in the morning meant something had triggered a need to verify that every person in the facility was where they were supposed to be. I found this out 20 minutes later when my father appeared in the break room doorway looking like a man who had received information he was still processing. He said, "Stay here. I mean it this time." I said I hadn't moved. He said, "Good." He left again. The second thing happened at 1:15. I had eaten my pretzels and finished the history assignment and started on calculus, which I was failing in the quiet, sustained way of someone who understood the concepts in isolation but lost the thread the moment they were combined into actual problems. C.O. Nanthakumar came back into the break room and poured a coffee she did not drink and stood at the counter with her back to me for about 30 seconds before turning around and saying, "Your dad asked me to check on you." I said I was fine. She said, "Good." She said it the way people say things when the word they want is something else entirely. I closed my calculus notebook. I said, "What's happening?" She looked at me, the specific look of an adult deciding how much a teenager can handle, and said, "There's been an incident in the East Wing. Nothing you need to worry about." I told myself she was right, and that incidents in correctional facilities were probably not unusual, and that unscheduled counts probably happened all the time for reasons that did not involve anything worth worrying about. I kept telling myself that for another hour. By 2:30, the facility had a different quality to it. Not louder, actually quieter, in the specific way of places where normally ambient noise has been suppressed by something deliberate. I could hear from the break room the sound of radio communication that was more frequent than it had been in the morning, the specific pattern of voices calling and receiving that indicated coordination rather than routine check-in. I had grown up with a father who wore a radio on duty, and I understood the difference between the sound of normal radio traffic and the sound of everyone on the same channel at the same time. This was the second. I got up and looked through the small window in the break room door into the administrative corridor. Two officers I had not seen before were standing near the security station talking to Earl Drummond, who was looking at something on a tablet and whose expression did not resemble anything I had seen at the department picnics. I went back to my chair. My calculus notebook sat open on the table, and I looked at the numbers without seeing them. What I learned, in the accumulating way you learn things in a crisis, in pieces, out of order, with gaps that your brain fills with the worst available interpretation, was this. Darius Fell, age 34, convicted of 2 counts of aggravated assault and 1 count of voluntary manslaughter, had been placed in administrative segregation 11 days earlier after an incident involving 2 officers that had sent one to the hospital with a fractured orbital bone. He had been in solitary confinement in the East Wing, in a cell with a reinforced door and a viewing slot and a camera that was supposed to be monitored continuously. The camera had experienced what was later described in the official incident report as a signal interruption of approximately 42 minutes. When the interruption resolved and an officer went to conduct a visual check at 11:22 that morning, Darius Fell's cell contained his mattress, his meal tray from breakfast, his personal property bag, and an absence where Darius Fell was supposed to be. This was the count. This was the incident. This was the reason my father's face had done the thing it had done in the doorway. I want to be precise about what I understood in that break room about the specific nature of the danger, because the story I am telling is not primarily a story about Darius Fell. It is a story about what I found out during the 6 hours I spent at Harrogate that day, and some of what I found out was about Fell, and some of it was about something else entirely, and the something else is the part that has stayed with me longer. But the Fell situation needs to be understood first because it was the container everything else happened inside. Darius Fell was not simply a dangerous man in the abstract sense. He was a specific kind of dangerous. Organized, patient, strategic. The officer he had put in the hospital had not been injured in a rage. He had been injured at the precise moment when the cell surveillance camera was obstructed by a food tray positioned against the door slot, a position that Fell had apparently practiced achieving multiple times over 3 days before the assault. He planned things. He executed the plans. He was now somewhere in or adjacent to a 340 inmate facility and no one knew exactly where. The institutional machinery that activated was, from what I could observe through that break room door window, and from what CO Nanthakumar told me in careful installments across the afternoon, substantial and coordinated. Deputy Warden Claudette Abiodun, who had 26 years in corrections administration and who ran Harrogate's day-to-day operations, had been at a regional conference in Philadelphia when the count was called. She was back at Harrogate by 1:30, which meant someone had driven approximately 90 miles in under 2 hours, which told me something about the urgency. She was a tall woman with close-cropped gray hair who I saw twice through the corridor window, both times moving with the specific purposeful speed of someone who was managing multiple active problems simultaneously. State police had been notified. The Pennsylvania Department of Corrections emergency protocols had been activated. Every inmate not in administrative housing had been returned to their cells. The facility was in full lockdown. My father was somewhere in the East Wing with a radio and a flashlight, and whatever 22 years of working with people like Darius Fell had given him in the way of instinct and judgment. I sat in the break room and did not do my calculus. The thing I was not supposed to find out happened at 3:05. CO Nanthakumar had been in and out of the break room throughout the afternoon, and at 3:05 she came in to check on me and received a radio call that sent her immediately back out, and in her movement she knocked her jacket off the hook by the door, and the jacket fell and its inside breast pocket landed open. And what slid out of the pocket was not her personal phone but a second phone, a prepaid flip phone of the kind that was not issued by the Department of Corrections, that landed on the floor of the break room face up with its screen lit from the impact, and on the screen was a text message that I read in the second before I picked it up to hand back to her. The message was from a number saved only as a letter, D, and it said, E-corridor, maintenance closet, give it 10 more minutes. I picked up the phone. I stood with it in my hand for a moment. Then I heard CO Nanthakumar coming back down the corridor, and I put it back in her jacket pocket and hung the jacket back on the hook and sat down and looked at my calculus notebook, and my hands were doing something I had never felt them do before, a sustained, fine tremor that made the pencil shake against the paper. She came back in. She looked at her jacket, then at me. She said, "Did anything fall out?" I said no. I thought the pocket was fine. She nodded. She took the jacket and left. I sat with what I had read for approximately 4 minutes before I understood what I was going to have to do with it. and those 4 minutes were the longest of my life to that point. D was not a difficult initial to decode in the context of an escaped inmate named Darius Fell. E corridor was a location inside the facility. Maintenance closet was a location within a location. Give it 10 more minutes suggested timing, a window, something that was going to happen or not happen within a defined time frame. C.O. Priya Nanthakumar, 8 years in corrections, had a prepaid phone with a text from the man everyone in the facility was currently looking for. This was not a complicated inference. It was a devastating one. I got up. I told myself I should stay in the break room. I told myself I had misread the message, that the screen had been at an angle, that D stood for something else, that I was a 16-year-old who had been sitting in a beige room for 4 hours and was running on pretzels and anxiety and was not in a position to accurately evaluate anything. I stood at the break room door and looked through the small window into the empty corridor. I thought about the officer whose orbital bone Darius Fell had fractured. I thought about my father somewhere in the East Wing with a radio, looking for a man who had apparently had help getting out of his cell and was apparently still in the building. I thought about the 10-minute window. I pushed open the break room door. I did not go to E corridor. I want to be clear about that because what I actually did was both safer and, in retrospect, exactly right. I walked to the security station at the end of the administrative corridor where Earl Drummond was still standing with his tablet, and I stood in front of him and I said, quietly, I need to tell you something about C.O. Nanthakumar, and I need you to not tell her I told you. Earl Drummond looked at me for 1 second, the kind of second that contains a complete assessment of a person, and then he put down his tablet and said, talk. I told him exactly what I had seen, the jacket, the phone, the message, the initial D, E corridor, maintenance closet, 10 minutes. I told him the timing, which by then was approximately 8 minutes ago. Earl Drummond did not express doubt or ask me if I was sure or tell me I must have misread it. He picked up his radio and said, in the flat, precise language of someone who had been in corrections for 23 years, E corridor maintenance closet, now, and somebody find Nanthakumar and sit on her until I say otherwise. He looked at me. He said, get back in the break room and lock the door. I went back to the break room and locked the door and sat on the floor with my back against the wall, which is where C.O. Nanthakumar found me 18 minutes later when she opened the door, with a key, not a knock, and looked at me with an expression that was no longer anything like the careful warmth it had been all afternoon. It was something else. Something that understood that the morning's careful performance had ended. I looked back at her, and neither of us said anything. Then the radio on her belt crackled and a voice said, Nanthakumar, please report to the deputy warden's office. She stood in the doorway for another 3 seconds. Then she left. They found Darius Fell in the E corridor maintenance closet at 3:19 p.m. He had been there, based on the physical evidence and the timeline of the camera interruption, for approximately 4 hours. He had a set of keys that did not belong to him, and a corrections officer's radio, and approximately $340 in cash. The keys were subsequently traced to a set reported as lost by C.O. Nanthakumar in January, which the investigation determined had not been lost. He was returned to administrative segregation and subsequently transferred to a higher security facility. He did not hurt anyone that day. I do not know if that would have been true without the text message I happened to see, and I try not to think about that too directly, because the answer to that question is one I would rather not live inside. C.O. Nanthakumar was removed from duty pending investigation within the hour. The investigation, which I know the broad outline of because my father's attorney explained it to me months later when I had to give a formal statement, revealed a relationship between Nanthakumar and Fell that had begun approximately 8 months earlier through a personal connection neither had disclosed and which had produced, over those 8 months, a series of contraband introductions, information transfers, and ultimately the coordination of an escape attempt that had used a manufactured camera failure as its mechanism. The investigation was conducted by the State Department of Corrections Internal Affairs Division with assistance from State Police Detective Corporal Wendell Osei, who had 14 years in law enforcement and who interviewed me twice and was the first person who treated my account with the complete seriousness it deserved without any preliminary skepticism that I needed to overcome. My father found me in the break room at 4:35 after C.O. Osei, Detective Corporal, which I kept getting wrong, had already taken my initial statement. He looked like a man who had run a very long distance and had just been told he could stop. He sat down across from me at the mismatched table and put his hands flat on the surface and looked at them for a moment before looking at me. He said, "Earl told me what you did." I said, "Okay." He said, "I need you to know that what you did was..." He stopped. He tried again. He said, "You made the right call." I said I knew. He said, "You also scared me more than I've been scared in 19 years of doing this job." I said I thought that was fair. We sat there in the beige break room with the coffee maker wheezing through its cycle and my calculus notebook open on the table, and I looked at my father, a man I thought I understood, a man whose job I had thought was standing around. and I understood that I had been fundamentally wrong about what he did every day when he left our house in Millbrook and drove to this building. He did not stand around. He managed the space between order and chaos in an institution full of human beings who had done the worst things human beings do, and he did it every day. And he came home and did not talk about it because some things needed to stay contained in the space where they happened. I understood that now. I understood a lot of things I had not understood at 9 in the morning when we pulled into the Harrogate parking lot. The formal statement I gave to Detective Corporal Osei was conducted at the State Police Barracks 2 days later with my father present and with the assistance of an attorney named Gwendolyn Ferreira, who had 17 years of practice in criminal defense and civil matters, and who had been recommended by the Corrections Officers Union because my father was, as a result of the day's events, peripherally involved in the internal affairs investigation in ways that required legal guidance even for a person who had done nothing wrong. Gwendolyn Ferreira was a precise, unhurried woman who read my statement twice before I signed it and changed one word, messages, to message, singular, because I had only seen one and specificity mattered in formal documents. Detective Corporal Osei asked me 23 questions over the course of 90 minutes. I answered all of them to the best of my recollection. At the end, he said, "You did the right thing quickly." I said I almost didn't do it at all. He said, "That's what doing the right thing feels like, usually." The internal affairs investigation produced, over the following 4 months, findings that I know partly from the formal summary Gwendolyn Ferreira helped my father and me review, and partly from what my father told me in the gradual way he had begun telling me things about his work, carefully, in installments, with the judgment of a person deciding what was useful for me to understand. C.O. Priya Nanthakumar was terminated and charged with 5 criminal counts, including conspiracy, promoting prison contraband, official misconduct, and 2 counts related to the coordinated escape attempt. She was subsequently convicted on 3 of the 5 counts and sentenced to 4 years. The investigation also identified a second officer, a man named C.O. Declan Voss, who had been employed at Harrogate for 3 years, who had been complicit in the camera interruption, not through the same relationship with Fell, but through a financial arrangement with a third party that the investigation traced through phone records and bank account analysis. Voss was also terminated and charged. The camera system at Harrogate was subsequently upgraded as part of a facility-wide security review that was triggered, at least in part, by the findings of the investigation. Deputy Warden Abiodun testified at both trials and was, according to Gwendolyn Ferreira's account of the proceedings, a formidable witness. My father did not lose his job. I want to say that clearly because the weeks between the incident and the formal clearance of his supervisory role were weeks I spent in a specific low-grade dread that I only recognized as dread after it lifted. His decision to bring me to the facility had violated the conditions of the approved visit. I had been in the break room and not the administrative wing during the lockdown period, which was a technical breach even though the circumstances were not of his making. Earl Drummond wrote a formal account of the day's events that was, according to my father, characteristically complete and characteristically fair. The internal review found that my father had not violated any protocol that contributed to the security breach, that he had not been aware of Nanthakumar's relationship with Fell, and that the decision to bring me to the facility, while a lapse in judgment under the circumstances as they developed, had not caused the security incident and had in fact, through an improbable chain of events, contributed to its resolution. He received a written reprimand. He kept his job. He never brought me to work again. I did not ask him to. What changed between us after that Thursday was not dramatic or sudden. It was the slow accumulation of a different kind of understanding. I had known my father my entire life as a large, careful, quiet man who went to a job he didn't describe and came home and made dinner and helped with homework and watched television and went to bed and did it again the next day. After that Thursday, I knew him as someone who managed 19 years of daily negotiation with a level of human volatility that most people never encounter, who had done this without complaint or credit, who had understood that I could not fully comprehend the job until I had seen it, and who had been right about that even though the seeing had happened in a way neither of us would have chosen. He started telling me more about his work after that. Not everything. Some things still needed to stay where they happened, but more. Enough that I began to understand the shape of it, the daily weight of it, the specific kind of courage it required that was nothing like the kind in movies, less about dramatic moments and more about the relentless maintenance of judgment and restraint and professionalism inside a system that tested all three constantly. I had thought my father's job was boring. I had been wrong in almost every particular. There is a thing that happened at the end of my second interview with Detective Corporal Osei that I have thought about many times since. He was wrapping up, collecting his notes, and he said to me, not as a formal question but as an almost offhand observation, "Your father's a solid CO. You know that?" I said I knew. He said, "Good people in that job get overlooked a lot. The bad ones make the news. Good ones just show up." I thought about my father showing up for 19 years without ever making the news. I thought about Earl Drummond with 3 ex-wives and a memory like a filing cabinet. I thought about C.O. Nanthakumar, who had also shown up for 8 years, and about what had happened to her showing up, and about the fact that the same institution that produced her had produced my father, and that the difference between them was not systemic, it was personal, chosen, daily. My father chose his showing up every morning for 19 years and never asked for anything in return for it except that the system function and the people in his care be treated with the specific, impersonal dignity that the job required. He did not get everything he asked for. He got enough. He kept going back. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, most of what holds any institution together, and I had needed to spend one Thursday in a beige break room with a wheezing coffee maker and a phone that should not have existed to understand it. My father retired from Harrogate 5 years after that day, at 24 years of service, with a pension and a commendation for his handling of a separate incident in his final year that I will not describe here because it is not my story to tell. At his retirement dinner, 20 people in a function room at a restaurant in Millbrook, colleagues and their families, Earl Drummond in a blazer that looked like it had been issued to his specific body. He gave a speech that was exactly 3 minutes long because he had timed it at home, which is the kind of thing my father does. He talked about the job in a way I had never heard him talk about it publicly, with a clarity and a directness that I think he had been building toward for a long time and had finally found the occasion to use. He said that working in corrections meant spending your career managing the gap between who people were and who the system needed them to be, and that the job required you to believe every day that the gap was worth managing, that there was something on the other side of it worth reaching, even when the evidence was difficult. He said he had not always succeeded at believing that. He said the days he had succeeded were the ones that made the days he hadn't worth getting through. People applauded. Earl Drummond did not applaud but nodded twice, which was, in Earl Drummond's register, an equivalent expression of the same thing. I sat at the table with my father's retirement plaque in front of me and thought about a Thursday in April and a beige break room and a phone that had fallen out of a jacket pocket at exactly the wrong moment for someone and exactly the right moment for everyone else. The gap was worth managing. He had believed that for 24 years. I believed it too now. That's the whole of it.